When I say the word patriarch, what names pop into your mind? Probably names such as Abraham, the man of faith. Maybe Isaac, the son of promise. Perhaps you even think about Jacob or Israel, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, or the father of the 12 that became the tribes of Israel. Yet I want you to think for a moment about somebody who is oftentimes overlooked when we talk about patriarchs from the Bible, and that is Joseph. In fact, more space is dedicated to Joseph in the book of Genesis than is dedicated to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. And in all of those chapters that talk about Joseph, there is not a single criticism mentioned of Joseph. Abraham had his doubts, made some mistakes. We're still paying for some of those mistakes even today. Isaac followed in his father's footsteps on a number of occasions when he kind of lied about his wife and who his wife was. Jacob had his problems too. Yet Joseph, nothing is mentioned negative about him. Now, some say, well, he may have had a bad attitude. He may have been stuck up, a snot-nosed brat kid and everything. But that's based on some of the things that we read, but it's not from what we read. And so in the Bible itself, there's not a single criticism against Joseph. Well, indeed, the character of Joseph is worthy of our study. His nobility of character, his purity of heart and life, his decency as a ruler and as a brother make him, more than any other of the Old Testament characters, an illustration of that type of man which Christ was to give to the world in perfection. That's from the International Standard Biblical Encyclopedia. I don't want to be guilty of plagiarism. If you would open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 37. The story of Joseph stretches from Genesis 37 to Genesis 50. So let's begin reading no, I'm just kidding. We're not going to read the whole thing. Okay? We're going to read parts of it, and we may read a little bit more than we might normally read, but it's important, I think, as we review the life story of Joseph, that we make sure we base what we conclude on what the Word says, and not just what Carl says. So, and as we review his story, I believe we'll be reminded of the wonderful character displayed by this man of God. And so we begin with Joseph as a son in Canaan. As a son in Canaan, he also was a brother in Canaan. And his relationship with his brothers was somewhat, what's the word? Bad. Okay? It was somewhat bad. In fact, he was hated by his brothers. And not just a little bit of, every once in a while, they're siblings, and so they fight and fuss and everything, and then they make up and everything's all good. No. That wasn't how it was in this household. They hated Joseph all the time, every day, every week. It was bad. Now, they had good reason, some might say. He was constantly telling on them. That didn't help. Actually, we might say he was tattling on them. Genesis 37 verse 2 says, this is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. We're not even told what they did. I guess what they did doesn't matter. What they did, Joseph thought was bad enough that he had to go tell their father Jacob about. And when he told Jacob or Israel about it, obviously they got into trouble, and that couldn't have helped his relationship with his brothers. Speaking of Israel or Jacob, the favoritism shown by his father certainly hurt his relationship with his brothers. Let's continue in verses 3 and 4. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Did you grow up in a house with siblings, brothers and sisters maybe? Ever have an argument with them? Ever fight a little bit with them? Did you ever get to the point where you could not even say a kind word to them ever? Probably not. Because you see, how it worked in my house was I was allowed to pick on my older brother, and I was allowed to pick on my younger sister. And I guess they felt they were allowed to pick on me too. But if you wanted to pick on my brother, or you wanted to pick on my sister, you and I are going to have a problem. But in Israel's family, if you wanted to say something bad about Joseph, the brothers would say, yeah, you don't know the half of it. And they wouldn't take up for him at all. They would join in, and so they couldn't even say a kind word about Joseph. And the favoritism by his father was the root cause of all of that. I mean, he loved Joseph more, and he showed it. He showed it by giving him the robe, the coat of many colors. And then, tattling on his brothers, that didn't help things. The favoritism by his father, that didn't help his relationship. And then there was his dreams. His dreams that made it even worse. Okay, it's okay he had the dreams, but he had to go and tell his brothers his dreams. Let's pick up the story in verse 5 through verse 11 of Genesis 37. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. So you didn't think they could hate him more, but they found a way somehow. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Joseph is a little bit slow, maybe. I don't know. He told to his brothers, listen, he said, I had another dream. This time the sun, moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Okay, so his dreams not only strained even more his relationship with his brothers, started to strain his relationship with dear old dad, who had him as his favorite son. Well, you put all of these things together, and then one day Jacob asked Joseph to go check on his brothers. That's where it all started in the first place, tattling on them. Well, Jacob sends Joseph, and they see Joseph coming, and, well, they eventually sold him as a slave. Genesis 37:12 through 36. Now, that's better than what they originally intended to do. What they originally wanted to do was they saw him coming, and they said, here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him. Let's take his life, and then we'll see what comes of his little dreams that he had. But Reuben, the oldest, he has a little bit more responsibility as the eldest son. He says, no, let's throw him in the cistern over here, and we'll deal with him later. And Reuben plans on coming back later after the brothers have left and getting Joseph out of the cistern and taking him back to Jacob and probably telling Jacob, you might not want to send him out to us ever again, because he just about got killed by his brothers. Well, something happens and Reuben goes off by himself somewhere or another, and Judah, one of his other older brothers, sees a band of Midianites walking, traveling. And he has this brilliant idea. You know what? If we kill him, we're not going to get anything out of it other than the satisfaction of not having his dreams come true. Let's sell him as a slave, and then we'll make some money off of the deal. And so that's exactly what they do. They sell him as a slave, and they take his robe that he was wearing. See, that's another reason people think he may have had something of an attitude, because he's going out to spy on his brothers, and he's wearing that robe, kind of, look at what I've got. And that kind of maybe set him off a bit. I don't know. But anyway, they take that robe, they slaughter a sheep or a goat, and put the blood on the coat, take it back to Jacob. They say, we found this, examine it, see if it's your son's. And sure enough, Jacob sees it and assumes the worst, that a wild animal has destroyed his son Joseph. But even though he was hated by his brothers, Joseph remained faithful to his father. Some children rebel against their parents to win approval from their siblings, especially if they've done something to upset the siblings. Maybe if it was a more modern family or whatever, Joseph gives a bad report to his father about his brothers, but then he comes back and he tries to make it up to them. So, I'm so sorry, I didn't know Dad was going to go off on you like that, and let me make it up to you somehow. And in many families, this attempt to get in good with the older siblings works a little bit. The older sibling proceeds to have the younger sibling do something that's going to get them in trouble too, so that everybody's in trouble and equally miserable. Well, so anyway, Joseph, though, rather than trying to win the approval of his brothers, he remained faithful to his father, willing to obey his wishes. Look at chapter 37, verse 13. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. This was the last time that Jacob will send Joseph to check on his brothers. But he wants to check on his brothers, make sure that his sons are doing right by what they're supposed to be doing. Jacob, Israel, he knew that he could trust Joseph. The brothers, on the other hand, knew that they could not trust Joseph. Now, one might think that such ill treatment, followed by separation from country and family, would produce a fair amount of bitterness and hopelessness in such a young man. I mean, we read he was 17 years old when he was sold by his brothers. Yet the character of Joseph actually starts to shine even brighter as we consider Joseph as a slave in Egypt. When the Midianites get to Egypt, they sell Joseph to a man named Potiphar. And Joseph quickly rises in the ranks of Potiphar's slaves and servants. And he rises to a position of prominence and as an overseer in Potiphar's house. He was blessed by God. Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes. And Genesis 39, 1 through 6 tells us a little bit about Joseph and how he did everything to the very best he could do, and he knew he was serving God. Though he was a young man, he proved industrious and he proved trustworthy. He proved that he could handle responsibility. He made the best of a bad situation, and God blessed him. But God didn't just bless Joseph, God also blessed Potiphar and Potiphar's household. So Joseph found favor in Potiphar's eyes, but Joseph also found favor in another member of Potiphar's household's eyes, that of Potiphar's wife. In fact, he was handsome in appearance, and Joseph was tempted by Potiphar's wife. She tries to seduce him. Apparently, several times she tries to seduce him. And he resisted every time. He resisted out of faithfulness to Potiphar, but more importantly, out of faithfulness to God. In Genesis 39, verses 8 and 9, Joseph says to Potiphar's wife, "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" So there was some faithfulness to Potiphar, but the bottom line of it was, how could he do such a thing and sin against God? Her advance is spurned. She decides, well, you know what? If you're not going to do what I want you to do, then I have no use for you. And I know how my husband will have no use for you. And she concocts a story, spitefully accusing him wrongfully, angering her husband, and ends up with Joseph being imprisoned falsely. But even in prison, Joseph makes the best of a bad situation. He rises in prominence in the prison to where the prison warden puts him in charge of the other prisoners. Again, blessed by God, Joseph is favored by the prison warden. Verses 21 through 23 tell us about this, of Genesis 39. "The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did." He is completely trusted by the warden. And the warden is rewarded, it would seem, for that trust. But Joseph had another gift, not just excuse me. He was not just able to look at bad situations and see good in them and see God's handiwork through them. He also was able to interpret dreams. And Joseph interprets a dream for the baker and the butler of Pharaoh. But then when those dreams come to pass exactly as Joseph interpreted them and said that they would, and of course he always gives credit to God for the interpretation, not to himself, the butler forgets all about Joseph until Pharaoh has a dream in Genesis chapter 41. And he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, again acknowledging that God was the one providing the answer through Joseph, but that God was behind it, offering advice in regards to the dream's fulfillment. We're in Genesis 41 now, toward the end of that chapter. So falsely accused, wrongfully imprisoned, having the butler break a promise to Joseph to remember him and tell Pharaoh about him and get him out of prison, many might begin to wonder, what is the point of staying faithful to God? Why do I need to continue to be righteous? I mean, just bad thing after bad thing after bad thing after bad thing is happening to me. Why should I even try to serve God? But Joseph maintained his integrity. He knew that even though the butler maybe forgot about him, that God had not forgotten about him. Just as he found favor in the eyes of Potiphar and in the eyes of the prison warden, so he also enjoyed favor in the eyes of Pharaoh when we see Joseph as a prince in Egypt, or as a ruler in Egypt. As a ruler, he was wise in his service to Pharaoh. Genesis 41, verses 38 through 46 tell us that Joseph was 30 years old when he was exalted to rule over Egypt. 30 years old. Remember, he was sold when he was 17. So he's been gone 13 years, and he's gone from a slave in Potiphar's house to one of the most trusted people in Potiphar's house to a prisoner, to one of the most trusted prisoners, to the second in command of all of Egypt. He comes up with his plan, and Pharaoh allows him to carry it out. Look at Genesis 41, verse 44. 41:44 says, Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, but without your word no one will lift a hand or foot in all of Egypt. So in other words, Pharaoh says, Joseph, you the man. We're going to do what you say. And I'm Pharaoh, and what I say is that what you say is what I say, and therefore what you say goes. What you say is what's going to happen. And so his wisdom is displayed in his administration. He shows foresight in the years of plenty. Genesis 41, 47 through 49. He has the Egyptians save grain and store grain during the years of plenty. And he shows shrewdness during the years of famine. Look at verses 53 through 57 of Genesis 41. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but the whole land of Egypt, there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried out to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph and do what he tells you to do. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the countries came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe in all the world. But Egypt was prepared because Joseph had prepared them and had instructed them on how to be prepared. But later on, after they've been buying grain from Joseph, they run out of money. Can't plant crops. Crops don't come in. In Genesis 47, verses 13 through 26, people's money was gone, so he took livestock and land. And then a fifth of the harvest was Pharaoh's and all. And Joseph came up with ways to make sure that the Egyptians had food. But all the while, he was mindful of God's blessings. Look at Genesis 41, verses 50 through 52. But before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asna, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and my father's household. The second he named Ephraim and said, It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. So even in the naming of his sons, he remembers God. And he seeks to honor God. So he was wise in his service to Pharaoh, but even so, as a prince in Egypt, he was also merciful in his treatment of his brothers. Finally, he is reunited with his brothers and with his father, Genesis 42 through Genesis 45. He arranged for them to live in the land of Goshen because they were shepherds. And, Pharaoh is really excited about having the rest of Joseph's family live with them. And finally, he gives reassurance to his brothers that he has forgiven them. Notice first when he reveals himself to them, Genesis 45. Verses 4 through 8. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be not be plowing or reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance." Now look at verse 8. "So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." You see, the brothers thought they were being mean to Joseph. The brothers thought they were mistreating Joseph. The brothers thought they were getting even with Joseph, but the brothers weren't doing any of that really, because God was behind the whole thing. So God made Joseph a slave and sold him to Egypt. And God, that just sounds so unlike God. Well, God can always take the circumstances that we find ourselves in and bring about good, if we will just continue to be faithful to Him and continue to trust Him. And really, when their father Jacob died, the brothers thought, uh-oh, now he's going to come down hard on us. Genesis 50, verses 15 through 21. Now he's going to take his vengeance on us. And yet Joseph reassures them once again. And he is able to do this because he believes in the providence of God. He believed that God could make good things come out of evil intentions. Look at Genesis 50, verse 20. Genesis 50, verse 20. "You intended to harm me," he tells his brothers, "but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." He also knew that God would keep His promises made to His people. Look at verses 24 and 25. "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land, to the land He promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.' And Joseph made the sons of Israel swear an oath and said, 'God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place.'" So he speaks of the deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt. In the life and story of Joseph, we see the value of character. The value of character that is centered in faith and trust in God. The value of character that is devoted to serving God and man with honor and dependability. The value of character as unwilling to be deterred by the hatred, betrayal, and even forgetfulness of others. The type of character that is willing to forgive the wrongs committed by others. The type of character that is able to see the big picture, God's wonderful workings in the affairs of men. This noble character can be useful in all seasons of life as well. As a youth, when we are tempted and tried with no help from family or friend, when everyone around us seems to want to be, quote unquote, sowing their wild oats, we can stay true to what we know to be right. As a mature individual, as we move up those career ranks and are placed in charge of things with important responsibilities, we can look at Joseph and see how he handled those important responsibilities when he was second in command of all of Egypt. And as an aged person, knowing that death is imminent, knowing that death is coming, knowing that our life is pretty much behind us, we can still speak with confidence about going to the promised land. Not Canaan, but heaven. May the character of Joseph serve to inspire us to develop our character as well. That in some small way we can be, as Paul tells his young protege Timothy in 1 Timothy 4, verse 12. We can be an example to the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. So how is your character? Is your character what God would have it to be? Or is your character somewhat lacking what God would have it to be? If it's lacking, then you need to realize that God's plan for you is the best plan for you. And you need to let God's way be your way. You need to work on developing the same type of character that Joseph had. That even when bad things happened to him, even when he didn't know what was going on, he knew God was still in control and God was still in charge, and that he was going to remain faithful to God. If we can help you in some way to do that this evening through a public response, I want you to come to the front now as we stand and sing together.